My brother's truck was already in the driveway. That was the first thing I saw when I pulled up to the house. His truck, the black F-150 with the cracked taillight he'd been meaning to fix for 2 years, parked sideways across the gravel like he owned the place. He didn't. I sat in my car for a moment with the engine running. I looked at the front door. I looked at the envelope on my passenger seat. Then I turned off the engine and got out. I want to tell you what I did to get here, because none of what happened that afternoon makes sense without the 18 months that came before it. My father worked in a sheet metal fabrication plant for 31 years. The same plant, the same shift, the same parking spot he joked about having squatters' rights on. He retired at 63 because his knees gave out before his will did. My mother cleaned houses, other people's houses, for most of my childhood, and she did it without complaint, which I think says everything about who she is and nothing good about the world she was navigating. They were not people who asked for help. They were not people who talked about money except to say there wasn't enough of it. When the water heater went out the winter, I was 12. My father fixed it himself with a YouTube video and a part he ordered online. When my mother needed a crown on her back molar, she waited 8 months until she had enough saved. These were not dramatic sacrifices. They were just the texture of our life. I am 29 years old. I work in pharmaceutical logistics. I coordinate supply chain operations for a regional distributor, which sounds more impressive than it is until you look at the salary, at which point it becomes impressive again. I've been careful with money since I got my first paycheck. I don't say that to brag. I say it because it matters to what comes next. My brother is 34. He has my father's jawline and my mother's eyes and the financial habits of someone who genuinely believes things will work out. He's been in and out of sales jobs, a landscaping business that lasted one summer, a consulting period that I still don't fully understand. He's not a bad person. He loves our parents. He just loves them in the way that costs other people something. His wife, I will say less about, not because there isn't more to say, because I was raised not to be cruel. 14 months before my parents' 35th wedding anniversary, I sat down with a spreadsheet and a very specific intention. My parents had been renting the same house for 11 years. The landlord was not a villain. He wasn't raising the rent unreasonably. He maintained things when asked, but the house wasn't theirs, and I had watched my mother rearrange the furniture in a living room she would never own for 11 years, and something about that particular fact had been sitting in my chest like a stone. I had $94,000 in savings. I had been contributing to a high-yield account since I was 23, living with roommates longer than was comfortable, driving a car I bought used for $400 in cash. I want to be honest with you. I did not save that money thinking about this moment. I saved it because I was afraid, because I have watched my parents work themselves to the edge of their health and still come out without a net, and fear is a very effective saving strategy. I found a house 11 miles from where they were renting, 3 bedrooms, 1 story, a yard with 2 oak trees and a garden bed that had gone to weeds but could be something. It needed work. The kitchen was a decade behind. The bathrooms needed updating. The back porch was soft in 2 places. The asking price was $187,000. I want to be clear about what I did and did not tell people. I did not tell my brother. I told my mother I was looking at some things. She asked me what kind of things. I said investment things, which was technically true because I was investing in the only thing I'd ever truly believed in, which was her and my father having somewhere permanent to live. I made the offer in my name. I put down $60,000, everything I'd been holding for exactly this kind of moment, and financed the rest at a rate that still makes me feel slightly sick when I think about it. But not as sick as the alternative. I spent 4 months coordinating repairs, the porch, the kitchen cabinets, paint throughout, a new water heater that did not require a YouTube video to install. I did most of the painting myself on weekends. I drove 3 hours round trip on 6 different Saturdays. I furnished it slowly and deliberately. I did not buy things that looked like a furnished rental. I bought things that looked like a home. My mother has a blue ceramic bowl she's had since before I was born that she keeps fruit in. I bought a kitchen table the same color as that bowl. I am not explaining that for any reason except that it's the truth of how I was thinking. The plan for their anniversary was simple. Dinner, I told them. Somewhere nice. My father put on the blazer he saves for things that matter. My mother wore her pearl earrings. I drove them 40 minutes through a neighborhood they didn't recognize, and I pulled into the driveway of a house with a wreath on the door and the lights on inside. My mother said, "Whose house is this?" I said, "Yours." She put her hand flat against the passenger window and looked at the front door for a long moment before she said anything else. My father didn't say anything at all for almost a full minute. He just looked at the yard. He looked at the oak trees. He looked at the garden bed I'd cleared and replanted with the specific rose variety my mother had mentioned wanting once in passing, probably 2 years ago. Then he said, "You did this." It wasn't a question. I had set up the deed with a right of survivorship in both their names, with a legal structure that my attorney had spent considerable time explaining to me. The property taxes were on autopay through an account I'd funded for 8 years. The homeowner's insurance was paid annually. I had a binder, organized, tabbed, laminated where relevant, that explained everything they would need to know about the house, the accounts, the maintenance schedule, the neighbors. I gave them the binder at the kitchen table with a bottle of wine I'd left in the refrigerator. My mother cried twice before we got to tab 3. That was 14 months ago. My brother found out approximately 6 weeks later because my father told him. My father tells my brother everything, which is a quality I love about my father and a fact I had fully accounted for. I know exactly what my brother said when my father told him because my father called me afterward, a little uncertain, a little apologetic, and told me that my brother had said she should have talked to the family first. I let that sit for a moment before I responded. I said, "It was my money, Dad." My father said, "I know." There was a pause. My father said, "He's not wrong that it would have been nice to be included." I said, "You were included. It's your house." My father laughed a little at that, which I think meant he understood what I meant. What I meant was, there is a version of including the family that results in a dream being converted into a committee, and committees do not buy houses. I had done the thing. The thing was done. The discussion of whether the thing should have been discussed was, at that point, decorative. My brother did not call me directly for 11 days. When he did, the conversation was careful in the way that conversations are when someone is performing reasonableness while feeling something else. He said it was incredible what I'd done. He said Mom and Dad were so happy. He said he just wanted to make sure everything was set up correctly from a legal standpoint, because he'd been looking into some things. I told him everything was set up correctly. He said he'd heard that sometimes these kinds of arrangements could create complications down the line for the whole family. I said, "What kind of complications?" He said, "Just, estate stuff, tax stuff. It might be worth talking to someone together." I said I had talked to someone, my attorney, individually, which was the appropriate way to handle legal matters pertaining to a property I had purchased with my own money. The conversation ended pleasantly. People who are planning something often end conversations pleasantly. I want to tell you about the Saturday I showed up to my parents' house and found his truck in the driveway. This was approximately 7 weeks after that phone call. I had driven down to help my father fix the gate latch on the back fence. A minor thing, a Saturday morning thing, the kind of errand that had become a regular part of our rhythm since they'd moved in. I had not been told my brother was coming. My parents had not mentioned it when I talked to my mother the night before. I sat in the car. I looked at the cracked taillight. Then I picked up the envelope on my passenger seat. I'll tell you what was in it in a moment. And I went inside. My brother was at the kitchen table. His wife was standing near the counter with a mug of coffee that my mother had clearly just handed her. And there was something about the way she was standing, slightly in front of the counter, slightly between my mother and the cabinet, that I noticed without being able to immediately name. My brother stood up when I came in. He smiled the way people smile when they were hoping for more time before something happened. He said, "Hey, you're here." I said, "I'm here." I looked at my father, who was seated at the other end of the table. My father's hands were flat on the tabletop. I know my father's hands. I know what they look like when he's resting, and I know what they look like when he's holding himself still. He was holding himself still. I set the envelope on the counter next to my keys, and I said, "What's going on?" My brother said, "We were just talking." My mother was at the stove, even though there was nothing on the stove. She was standing at the stove facing the burners with a dish towel in her hand. I said, "Mom, what are you cooking?" She turned around. She said, "Nothing." And then she looked at my brother in a way I had seen her look at him my entire life. The look that means she is trying to love him past the thing he is currently doing. And she said, "Your brother had something he wanted to talk about." My brother sat back down. He put his hands on the table in a way that I think was meant to look relaxed. He said, "It's not a big thing. We've just been looking at some options, and we thought it made sense to talk as a family." I pulled out a chair and sat down. He said, You know how hard things have been with the business. We've been, it's been a tough couple of years, and we've been looking at ways to stabilize things. And someone suggested to us that this house, the way it's set up, with mom and dad's names on it, that there might be a way to use it as a vehicle, like a co investment. We contribute to the upkeep in exchange for a partial stake. And then eventually, I said, no. He stopped. I said, no. That's not going to happen. His wife put down the coffee mug. She said, it's actually more complicated than just. I said, I know what it is. She looked at me. I looked at her. I want to be very clear that I did not raise my voice at any point during this conversation. I did not need to. I said, I purchased this house. It's in my parents' names. There is a legal structure in place that I set up with an attorney, and that structure does not include a pathway for anyone to acquire a stake in this property, not through upkeep contributions, not through any other mechanism. My brother said, you don't have to be defensive. We're family. I said, I'm not being defensive. I'm being accurate. He said, the thing is, mom and dad are the ones on the deed. I said, with specific legal protections that I'm happy to explain to you. I reached over and picked up the envelope. I want to tell you something about that envelope, because people have asked me later when I've told this story, whether I brought it because I knew, whether I had come prepared. The honest answer is yes, not because I had specific intelligence about what was going to happen that Saturday, but because I had understood from the moment my brother said, it would have been nice to be included, that there was a version of events in which someone would try to convert my parents' home into a resource. And I had decided at that point that preparation was the most loving thing I could offer. I pulled out the first document and I slid it across the table. I said, this is the deed structure. You'll see that mom and dad hold it with right of survivorship, which means it passes directly between them without going through probate. It cannot be sold, leveraged, or encumbered without both of their signatures and a specific legal process that would require independent legal counsel for each of them. I pulled out the second document. This is the funding account for property taxes and insurance. It's in a trust that I administer, with mom and dad as sole beneficiaries. No other party can access or direct those funds. I pulled out the third document, and this is a letter from my attorney documenting the full purchase history, the funding source, and the current legal structure. If anyone, were to attempt to acquire an interest in this property through any mechanism, this documentation establishes beyond any question who purchased it, with what funds, and for what purpose. The kitchen was quiet. My father's hands were still on the table, but they weren't holding themselves still anymore. My brother looked at the documents for a long time. Then he looked up at me. He said, you really did all this? I said, I really did all this. His wife picked up her purse from the counter. She said something to my brother that I didn't fully hear, and then she said goodbye to my mother in a tone that was carefully neutral, and then she went outside. A few minutes later, I heard the truck start. My brother sat at the table for a little while longer. He looked at the documents. He looked at me. He looked at my father. My father said, son. My brother said, I know, Dad. There are things I don't know about what was said in that kitchen before I arrived. I have a picture of it. The way my mother was standing at the stove, the way my father's hands looked, and I don't need the full dialogue to understand the shape of what was happening. What I know is that my parents are not people who fight. They are people who go quiet when they are hurt, and they had been very quiet. My brother left about 20 minutes later. He hugged my mother at the door. He shook my father's hand, which is something I had not seen him do in years. He said to me in the doorway, you think of everything. I said, I try. He nodded. He walked to his truck, and he drove away. I stood with my parents in the kitchen for a while. My father made coffee. My mother refolded the dish towel she had been holding since I walked in and put it on the oven handle where it belongs. Then we went out to fix the gate latch. My father held the parts and handed them to me when I needed them, and we didn't talk about what had happened inside. We talked about the oak trees, whether the one on the left was leaning slightly or whether that was just the afternoon light. We talked about the garden bed and what she wanted to put in it this fall. We talked about nothing that mattered and everything that did. At some point, my father said, you always carry that stuff around with you? Those documents? I said, I've had them in my car since about a month after you moved in. He was quiet for a moment. He said, that's my girl. I don't have a dramatic ending for you. There was no final confrontation, no scene where everything was resolved with perfect clarity. My brother and I have spoken since then. We are careful with each other in the way that siblings sometimes are after something like this. Not cold, but deliberate. He has not brought up the house again. I do not know what he told his wife. I do not know what she told him. What I know is that my mother planted dahlias in the garden bed in October. I know that my father has a chair on the back porch where he sits in the evenings, and that when I pull up to the house and walk around the side yard, I can usually find him there with a cup of coffee, watching the light change over the yard that is his. He doesn't have to be anywhere else. That was the point. I spent a lot of time before all of this, believing that protecting people you love was about being present at the right moment, about showing up when things went wrong. What I understand now is that real protection is structural. It is built before you need it. It is unsexy and procedural, and it lives in folders and legal documents and conversations with attorneys that cost money and take time. You cannot defend something you did not think to fortify. I do not tell this story to make my brother a villain. He was operating from his own fear, his own need. And people in that position will use whatever is available to them. What I tell this story for is this. If you are the person who carries people, if you are the one who shows up, who plans, who holds the weight because you're the one who can, then you need to protect your work. Not with walls, with paperwork, with structure, with the understanding that love without documentation is just a feeling, and feelings do not hold up in a kitchen when someone with a plan shows up uninvited on a Saturday morning. My parents have been in that house for 14 months. The garden looks good. The porch no longer has any soft spots. The gate latch works. That's enough. That's everything.